Good morning. Welcome to our class on the Ten Commandments, everyone who is here in person and those who will be watching at a distance via the video. I'm going to offer the introduction. The running joke in the pastoral team is anytime we talk about adult education and we come up with a topic, my hand shoots up first. I'll do the introduction because I am by nature a 30,000-foot kind of person. So I leave the detail to others who are more capable. So I am excited about this class on the Ten Commandments for a couple of reasons. In part, it is a core part of our catechetical instruction confirmation class with our kids, which means many of us who may have gone through confirmation at one point have learned about the Ten Commandments, but I'm guessing most of us, maybe we could use a refresher. And what we find out with our kids, of course, I think is true across years, is that we have a lot of, if not misconceptions, at least some different perceptions of what the Ten Commandments are. And I think it is interesting to kind of open them up. And one of the things, I think it's a place where I see Martin Luther's distinctive take on the faith come through most clearly. And we'll get into that as we go. And it has helped, he has helped me think about the Ten Commandments as a group and individually much differently than I would have otherwise. And so a full year ago, when we were doing in the Living the Message class, when we were talking about kind of 7 essential stories or 8 essential stories, this was one of them for me because I think it's really important. I think that the way we understand the Ten Commandments helps to shape, consciously or unconsciously, the way we think about God. And so I think it's one of those pivotal passages that as you understand it more, I think you understand the God we worship more as well. And so I'm excited about that. So the title we chose for this introduction is Your Neighbor's Best Life Now. And that is an intentional play on a best-selling book by the author and televangelist Joel Osteen, who, and if I had been thinking, I would have pulled that book off of Amazon or pulled a picture of Joel Osteen. He has a very, very big smile, very handsome guy, prime televangelist, and one of his first bestsellers was Your Best Life Now. And Joel Osteen comes from a tradition in the church that's sometimes regarded or referred to as the prosperity gospel, where if you live your life according to God's principles, you will benefit not just spiritually, but materially. And so his book was, here are all the things you need to do so that you can start leading your best life now. And one of my closest friends for 25 years now was someone I met in graduate school, and then we ended up teaching together on the faculty at Luther Seminary for a number of years, Rolf Jacobson. And he is an Old Testament scholar, and he would always say the Ten Commandments are really about your neighbor's best life now, and the difference it makes when you go through life thinking less about yourself. Do I have enough? Am I okay? Am I getting what I need, what I want? And think more about my neighbor. How is my neighbor doing? Is my neighbor getting what they need? And the difference it makes in the way that we live our lives, the way we experience life. And so Rolf and I had a deal. We taught together many, many times, and we each told the other, when one of us has a good idea or a good story and the other uses it, we will give credit to the other one the first 3 times. After that, it's all mine. But this was so insightful by Rolf. This is now like the 43rd time I'm giving him credit. And I fully expect someday he will write his book, his commentary on the Ten Commandments, and he'll name it just that. So if anyone sees Rolf, you let him know. I'm doing him good. All right. So I'm going to, we're going to look at this just very quickly just to remind you that we're going to come back to this, but this is in Exodus 20, 1 to 17. This is the kind of laying out of the Ten Commandments. And we will go back and look at it more carefully, but this is the scene. And what I want to draw attention to just at this moment, before we come back to it in more detail, was that first sentence. Then God spoke all these words. And in a little bit, we'll jump back to what happens before, because there's a then. It starts with a then, so you know it's coming after a significant event. But what's significant for me about this is then God spoke all these words. We call them the Ten Commandments. The Old Testament does not refer to them as commandments. When you read them, the force of them, they sure feel like a commandment. Do this, don't do this. But I think it's interesting that it begins with, then God spoke all these words. And so really, if we were going to refer to them more literally, it would be the 10 words. And I think that's important, that it's not simply a do this command. It is words of wisdom, words of life, which I think is our overarching title for this class. Right, Katie? And that comes from that Hebrew sentence, dabar, to say or to speak. And the root of all words in Hebrew are verbs, which is just interesting in itself. There's a sense of the power and potency of language, so that the word is a derivation of the word to speak. And so words, the dabar, it is a verb, words have power. And that is one of the themes of the Old Testament, particularly God's words have power. And one of the signature places is in the beginning in Genesis, when God says, let there be light, and there was light. And the Hebrew actually is more compressed. We translate it as, and the Lord said, let there be light, 4 words, and there was light, 3 more. In the Hebrew, it simply says, be light, light was. It is the sense of almost an executive order that God speaks things into existence. And I think that's important for us to remember as we get into this. So in that first verse of Exodus 20, the recounting of the giving of the 10 Commandments, the 10 words, that is said twice. And God spoke, dabar, all these words, dabar. Now, if you are thinking to yourself, well, that's kind of interesting, but really, Pastor, so what? Here's what I want to get at. I want to think about, can we shift our understanding of this passage by backing off just a little of the force of the word commandment? I don't mind if we call them the 10 Commandments. I will call them that all the time. It's not that, but to sort of step back and recognize that word sometimes shades our perception or influences our interpretation, and take a half step back and allow these words to speak differently to us. And that's primarily because, at least in our culture, our language, commandments feel like they are negative or restrictive or prohibitive. They're no fun. We don't like commandments. We don't like the idea of people commanding us. All of that. Thou shalt not. And I think what that leads to is 2 important points of confusion. The first is that we can think about the commandment then, the 10 Commandments, as a requirement. If you do this, then you will be my people. And I think part of the legacy of the Christian tradition, reading through the Gospels and reading through Paul, is that we tend to think of, unfairly, as Judaism as a religion, a tradition all about laws, what you can't and can't do. And we tend to think then of it as a conditional religion, that the promise of God to the Israelites was, if you toe the line in a certain way, then I will be your people. And that then sets up a certain way of thinking about God. It sets up this conditional relationship. Do this and get that. But, and here's my little mnemonic device for this point, 19 comes before 20. Every list of numbers you'll ever find, 19 comes before 20. I could have put the so what slide again, but I did not. And what I mean by that is it's in the story. We will spend a little time with Exodus chapter 19 first to hear the context and then move to chapter 20. And in chapter 19, I'm just going to read that and then call some things out as we go. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the Israelites." So Moses came, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. The people all answered as one, "Everything that the Lord has spoken we will do." And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. A couple of things I want to highlight. I think it's really interesting that God begins the dialogue, begins the conversation, and we'll see this when we get to the 10 words themselves, by saying, "You saw what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." The first thing God does is remind Israel of the relationship that they have already with God and the character of God to save and to rescue. God reminds them that He is trustworthy. Do you remember what I did for you? I carried you away from the Egyptians. And that word Egyptians is then fraught with oppression and slavery and misery and all. I took you away from that and brought you to myself so that you could be my treasured possession. Then on the basis of that relationship, God says, "If you obey my voice and covenant, you'll be my treasured possession out of all people. The whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly nation." So God has expectations. Covenant is mutual expectations and responsibilities both ways. It's not that those aren't there, but as we go on, what we see is then Moses brings the words of the Lord to the Israelites, and the people all answered as one. One of the things I pay attention to in reading is anytime an author uses that word all, it is signaling the significance of this event that's being narrated, because all the people never gather together. All the people never speak in one voice. And so if they do, then you know this was momentous. It'd be kind of like saying, on June 15th, Mount Olivet held a congregational meeting to call a new pastor, and all of Mount Olivet attended. And no description of how the 16,000 people fit into the sanctuary. But it is singular. All the people responded in one voice, the unanimity. And then finally, and so Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. So in chapter 19, you hear this covenant, this agreement being made. God reminds them of the relationship they had, tells them, "You will be my people and to obey me." They all answer. So at this point, that relationship is established, which means that what comes next is the giving of the law. The covenant is made in chapter 19. Chapter 20 then isn't a requirement to be God's people. Here's what you'll need to do, but rather it is the gift of a loving God to God's people. That is, because you are my people, I am giving you this law to help you order your life, to help you get more from life with each other. It is this sense of gift and reveals the character of God's heart as parental. I want you to take care of each other. I want the very most out of life for you. In some ways, the 10 Commandments, as we'll delve into them later, the other name we could have called this is life's little instruction book. Because most of the commandments as we get into are not nitty gritty. There are other places, all kinds of, if this happens, do this, or if that happens, try that. But here it is like basic parameters of what life together can be like if we seek our neighbor's fortune first. So that's one. That the point of confusion, I think, when we think about them as commandments, is that they're a requirement. And when you're reading the story, narratively, they're just not. the commandment is made, the covenant is made, the relationship is established, the law then comes as a gift. The second point of confusion I've kind of already alluded to is that when we think of them primarily as negative, prohibitive commandments, then the picture we have of God is increasingly that of a dictator-like king. Do this or else. That justice is the only or the primary category in which God relates to us. And as I've kind of alluded to, as opposed to imagining God as a king, one of the descriptions of God, but as a loving parent, one who cares deeply, desperately for the people of God. And so with that kind of in mind, then let's look at some of the commandments more, particularly in that sense of the broadness of them. As I like to say, when you get to, and I'm going to just focus on a few further down, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. These are the basic building blocks of civilization and of community. Like, if it's okay to murder, things are not going to go well. I remember a comedian once doing a bit, not a theologian, don't even know if he went to church, probably for sure not a Lutheran. And one of his lines was, the chief thing keeping people from murdering is that it's not okay to murder. And then sort of, imagine if it was. Each of us here would probably have killed some people. Like, we think we won't, but if it was okay, we would probably be doing, like that's that whole bit. And it's so funny because it is like sort of extreme. And then you're like, yeah, probably. It's not okay. It's not okay to lie. Like, you can't have community if you can't have any sense that we shouldn't be lying against each other or stealing from each other. So this is not rocket science. These are broad parameters through which to live our life. And when I think about them that way, again, it reinforces for me that more positive dimension of the Ten Commandments, that yes, they are saying what we can't do, but to what end? So that the people around us are better off. And it reminds me of a story that my first colleague in parish ministry told. He said he was 8 years old, and he was in an argument with his sister, and before long, the arguing turned to shoving, and shoving turned to hitting, and he had his sister all of a sudden on the ground, and his fist was in the air, when his mother came into the room and said, "Franklin, stop that." And Frank, the way he told it was, and I lifted my head and looked to my mother and said, as only an 8-year-old boy can, "She is my sister. I can do whatever I want to her." And his mother swooped across the room, towered over him, and said, "She is my daughter. No, you can't." That's the force of the law. God saying to each of us, when we look around at the people around us, "These are my children. No, you can't steal. No, you can't hurt them. No, you can't kill them. No, you can't hoard everything. No, you can't keep good things from them." That's the force of the Ten Commandments. God is a loving parent saying, "These are my children too." And I think that's sort of the power that I want to reclaim or recapture as we go into the Ten Commandments with greater detail the next couple of weeks. And it's what we try to lift up with our kids, to kind of invite them to imagine God as a parent who cares for them and wants the best for them, and as the Ten Commandments as a way to have a better life by looking out for each other. And I think that's the force of my friend Rolf's insight, that it's not your best life now, or the route to your best life is by caring for your neighbor's best life. Because when you're looking out for yourself, it's you against the world, always. And anyone else who might have something or have something you don't can become then a competitor or an adversary, as opposed to a community where you are looking out for the other 34 people in the room, and then you realize, and they all are looking out for me. So suddenly it's not you who have to take care of yourself all the time. It's 34 other people. In just this example, 34 other people who are looking out for you. And so as we look out for each other, suddenly the number of people promoting a sense of the goodness of life or all that God has in store for us multiplies. And so, as I mentioned before, I think this is one of the places where I find Martin Luther just exceptionally helpful. Luther, when he writes his catechisms, actually, let me back up a little bit. So, because it's been a while since many of us have been in confirmation, including myself. Quick question: how many of you had to take confirmation with your dad? It was fine. I didn't talk a lot, which was unusual. So Luther wrote a small catechism and a large catechism. And the small catechism he actually didn't write for 6th and 7th graders. He wrote it for parents to help their children learn the faith. And the larger catechism he wrote for pastors to help them teach parents how to teach their kids the faith. And what the catechisms cover are essentially the faith basics: the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the sacraments, communion and baptism. And what Luther does is take these sort of central pieces of the faith and then breaks them down into bite-sized pieces and looks at each one of them. So we just began our unit with the kids on the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven. Okay, actually, we broke it into two. What does it mean by calling God our Father? And what do we mean when we say who is in heaven? To kind of explain it. And as Luther is doing this, he uses this question at each point where he will recite the piece he's looking at, and then ask a question, was ist das? Or in English, what does this mean? And so that's what we do with our kids in confirmation. That's what we're trying to open up also. What does this mean? And what I find really interesting is when Luther is looking at the commandments, he is absolutely clear on the prohibitive, on the negative. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on then to show the positive force of that commandment. So for instance, when we get to the 8th commandment, it is thou shalt not bear false witness. And I always think of the 8th commandment for two reasons. One is that when we're teaching the kids the 10 commandments, we do it now with hand signs. So I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other God. So first commandment, no other God before you. You shall not take the second commandment. You should not take the name of your Lord in vain. So it's like, helping the kids remember what it is. The 8th is my favorite. You shall not, you shall not bear false witness. The kids love that one too. Or some of them, the 5th commandment, thou shalt not murder. Trust me, it works. I can tell you're already getting it. You're going to go home and think about bearing false witness. So Luther will say this means you should not lie about or to your neighbor. But it also means you should put the best construction on what your neighbor says. And what I love about Luther's catechism is he does that in each place. So you should not kill, but you should also look to promote the welfare of your neighbor. So it's not just what you shouldn't do, but then Luther offers to bring out that positive dimension of a parent who wants to give life-giving instructions to his children. Luther then demonstrates that with each of the commandment. You shall not, what does this mean? The 8th commandment, you shall not lie about or to your neighbor. And you should put, whenever possible, the best construction on what your neighbor says. Think for a minute if that's the way we operated in life. In our relationships, in our civic life, and our across the board, what would it be like if we made a determined effort to put the best construction on what someone has said to us, instead of immediately jumping out of our insensitivity or the tension to, oh, I can't believe well, I wonder, and then that became the basis of the conversation relationship. And so I love that about Luther, and that's part of what we want to do now. So to think about it this way, God's 10 words of counsel for God's beloved people. Typically, we will talk about, or biblical scholars will talk about, two tables. The first 3 commandments are about our relationship with God, and the next 7 are about our relationship with each other. And so I thought I'd just take a minute or two. I know my colleagues will be going into greater detail, but to look at how these two relate to each other. Because, and I'm going to spend a little more time on the first table, because I think when we think about the 10 Commandments as life's little instruction book, or putting your neighbor first, or your neighbor's best life now, the second table, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, that all makes sense. Like, yes, these are the kind of things we want to do. Why does God start with commandments about our relationship with God? What does that have to do with it? And I think that's the other place where the misconception shall be. So that we hear something like, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. We think, well, is this just like a possessiveness? Is this God just, I want you for myself? Like, what is going on? And I think there's more to it to that. So this is what we hear as the commandment, but similar to chapter 19, where God establishes the relationship reminds Moses of the relationship that God has. So the full commandment says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And I think the force of this is that what God is essentially doing is pleading with the Israelites to remember that God is inherently trustworthy, that they can trust all that will come, because the words that come are coming from a loving parent, not a fickle or capricious God, small g. So that there's a sense of what God is doing is establishing a relationship of trust. And in the same way, when you make a vow to someone to hold only onto them until as long as you both shall live, that is, I think, the analogy of what is happening in that first commandment. God is entering into, inviting them into that kind of exclusive relationship, in part because the Israelites are living at a time where all these different people around them, now in Egypt, as they move forward in the Promised Land, they will be surrounded by not just other peoples, but other gods. And those other gods will also vie for and compete for their attention and their allegiance. And what God is saying is, you can trust me. You cannot trust these others. And I will be the one to do good for you. And that regularly becomes their experience. When they adopt the gods of other lands, then they're pulled into all kinds of things, including child sacrifice or the oppression of the poor, all this other stuff that is somehow justified. And God is saying, look, do you remember who I am? I'm the one who has loved you from the beginning. And so the first commandment isn't just a commandment, it's also a promise. It's an establishing that relationship, that God is their God to be with them. So also in the second commandment, you shall not take the name of your God, of the Lord your God in vain, or you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. And I think this is a sense to remind the Israelites of what is the character of the relationship that they have, and that it is one, finally, of mutual respect, that God invites Israel into this relationship, and as a part of that, all the words that God is saying, the 10 words, are about God's respect and care for this people. And God expects a similar kind of respectful relationship back, and knows that if people begin misusing God's name or wrongful use, I swear to God, no, and think about how oftentimes when someone's under stress and you're having a disagreement or argument or they're in a tight situation, no, I swear to God. It feels like the more they say that, the more the odds go up that it's not true. that's what's about to come. That God feels like that not just dilutes the power of God's name, but it dilutes the relationship that God has, that the mutual respect that should be a part of this gets diluted by the regular misuse of one of the partner's names. And God kind of is saying up front, when you feel like you have to call my name to make a deal or to receive a deal or make an agreement, maybe it's not a good deal and you shouldn't be in it in the first place. Similarly, then the third commandment, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And I think this one gets particularly interesting because I think the way we have interpreted it, particularly in, a Protestant work ethic kind of Western culture, is, don't have any fun on Sundays. And so that goes back to the blue laws where stores weren't able to be open, you couldn't buy alcohol, all the restrictions that were put on Sundays, which is part of that prohibitive negative tradition. And so we have come to think, remember the Sabbath and Luther will say, you remember the Sabbath by going to church. Like he's no question about that. For Luther, it's because it's at church that you're reminded how much God loves you. That promise that you have infinite worth and value to God can be hard to remember in any given week, but especially when things are hard. Come back once a week to be reminded of how much God loves you. But over time, it's easier for us to hear it as, oh, so I have to be in charge. I shouldn't do anything fun. I shouldn't, on and on and on. And I want to kind of remember that differently in light of the people who were receiving this command. These were the Israelites who have recently been brought out of the oppression and bondage of Egypt, where they were slaves. And so I think their reaction would have been very different. I imagine when Moses reads the third commandment, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, and then God goes on to say that means it will be a day of rest. For 7 days the Lord created, on 6 days and God rested. You shall not work, your manservant or maidservant shall work, your animals shall not work, everyone rests. And again, we're like, oh, well, that doesn't sound very fun. You just have to hang out all day or go to church. But these are people who until very recently were slaves. And when they hear that, remember the Sabbath, the Hebrew word for rest, remember to rest and keep this day of rest holy, their reaction, I think, would have been, wait a second, we get to rest? That's new. We have rest. And God is saying, yes, not just you, the whole ordering of creation needs to rest. And what I think is really interesting about that is that about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago now, a pastor, retired pastor who was part of this congregation, sent me a write-up of a study of two sociologists who have studying rates of depression in the United States. And what got them interested was that rates of depression, as they could track it over the last century or so, were kind of, a little bumpy, a little even, maybe a tiny bit up. And then at a certain point in history, it just begins to ascend and it keeps climbing for the last 40 years or so. And so they did a variety of kind of cross studies to try to isolate. Like, it's rare to see such a strong change in a cultural behavior to one point. To one relatively short 5 or 10 years, everything began to change. And that got them really curious. And so they were testing out a variety of hypotheses about what it could have been that set that tradition. And what they concluded, and neither of them identify as church-going Christians, what they concluded was the era in which depression rates began to rise and take off was the era across the country when blue laws were repealed, when there was no longer an enforced day of rest. And that since that time on, everything has crept into that space, whether it's work or entertainment or infotainment the example I would sometimes use is when my parents grew up, there were no organized sports on Sundays. None. When I grew up, we had no school sports, but we had league sports, and they started Sundays at 2 o'clock on, Sunday afternoons. When my kids grew up, it is fair game. And I, like every other parent of a child in a league sport, spent at least one Sunday volunteering with Jack. It was a swim meets. And so I would be the timer, and it was a Sunday morning, and we weren't in church because that was a part of being a part of this group. It's like one small snapshot of the way in which the busyness of life creeps in. And there is now literally no Sabbath left. And so I found that sort of so interesting in terms of really ancient wisdom, God-given wisdom that we have ignored, and it's clearly to our detriment. And so how do we, and not everyone can rest on Sundays. I mean, we depend on certain people and their jobs and work, but how do we cultivate or reclaim some sense of Sabbath? Recognizing it's about saying no in order to say yes or experience more wholeness. And so I think that's kind of what's going on there. And then the second table, which again, my colleagues will spend more time on, is then about these responsibilities to your neighbor. And I like to think of it, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to be thinking about looking out for the welfare of your neighbor, trusting that in doing that, you will have a richer experience of life as well. And so as we go through these next couple of weeks, I'd invite you, as we're reading through particularly the second table, what do each of these commandments, not just what they prohibit, but what do they make possible? What do they invite? What do they create? And how do they help us live into a richer, fuller sense of the abundant life that God wants for all people? So let me close here. Again, thank you for being here, and thanks to all of the folks who are watching this video for being a part of this class at a distance as well.